Routers choose their OSPF router ID using a series of 3 rules. In this lab, you'll exercise all of those rules. In this video, I'll get you started in the lab. Let's jump in. This lab is meant for study and review of content that you'll find in the official Cert Guide Volume 1, Part 6, and Chapter 22. And all the config labs that you find in my blog are meant to build and let you practice those things you learn in the books. So this one's called OSPF Router IDs, with obviously the focus on OSPF Router IDs. Here's a direct link to the lab. You should go ahead and open a tab in a browser to that page if you haven't already. So to do the lab, you can open up the blog page and just use it. The top half of the page gives you the scenario and tasks to do in lab. Then you can do the lab on paper or using the Cisco Packet Tracer Simulator. And then in the bottom half of the page, read the answer and some explanations and comments about why I picked that particular answer configuration. However, this intro video is the equivalent of the scenario and task, but with a little different take, a little more depth. And there's also an associated review video for this lab that gives a little more depth to the answer and explanation. So take advantage of the rest of this video and the associated review video if it's useful to you. Let's do just that and intro this lab. There's a lot already configured for the initial state in this lab, so it'll take a few more minutes to work through. Here's our topology with interface IDs listed and a few subnets listed. And I'll tell you why I list those subnets and not the rest here in just a minute. All right, so you've got interface IDs. Let's focus on router R1. The initial state is all the IP addresses are configured, the interfaces are up, and OSPF is configured correctly on all 4 routers. OSPF is already working. So in this case, we've got configuration that looks like this. We've got all 4 interfaces with IP addresses, and they all have this same command, IP OSPF1 area 0. That command says enable OSPF process ID 1 and place the interface in area 0. So all 4 interfaces in this drawing are enabled for OSPF. They're trying to discover neighbors, they're finding neighbors on those WAN links, and so on. There's this lonely router OSPF1 command down here for the router process. But most importantly, this is all the configuration. So OSPF is up and working in R1. It's chosen a router ID based on its rules, based on this initial config, and that's your starting point in lab. Then the exercise is to change and add to this configuration to influence the choice of router ID, all right? But as a side note, you could open up the packet tracer file and ask yourself, all right, well, what should it have chosen based on this config as its router ID, and look and see if you get the answer right, all right? That's not what the lab asks. The lab asks you to configure new things. More on that in just a second. So there's R1's total config. So there are no other related configuration topics or commands that would influence the router ID choice at the initial opening of the packet tracer file. So to complete that picture, router R2, R3, and R4, here's R2. It's got the same thing. It's got interfaces, 2 interfaces, excuse me, with IP addresses configured and OSPF enabled interfaces in area 0. So it's a single area design, all interfaces in area 0. No subcommands on the router OSPF command. This is the sum total of meaningful initial config in router R2. Same way in router R3. OSPF enabled on each of the 2 interfaces. No other config that will influence the choice of router ID. And you guessed it, R4. Router process is configured. Both interfaces have addresses and are enabled for OSPF. So OSPF is up and working. Just no overt influence on the choice of router IDs. So at the end of this, if we look at this diagram, if we were to get into any of the 4 routers after opening up the downloadable packet tracer file at the lab, self-pings from each router, like R1 pinging its IP addresses on these 4 interfaces, they'll work. The interfaces are up. Also, pings of all the other routers' interface addresses will work, even the remote ones. Why? Because OSPF is working. R1, for instance, it will have a route to this subnet 2. R1 will have a route to subnet 4. R3 will have a route to subnet 1 and 4, and so on. So any remote subnets, each router will have routes for those already to start the lab. With that initial state, the lab itself is straightforward. You just have to remember the rules you learned in the book or the video and then apply them. So, different requirements on different routers, just to give you variety for practice. So on R1, we want to use router ID 1111. It's not right now. And we want to do that per an OSPF router config mode command. All right, that gives you enough to know what to do, but not so much as to totally give away the answer. And likewise, on R2, use router ID 2222. But we want that to happen because of a loopback interface. So you need information you learned elsewhere in order to do that. So I'm not trying to totally give away the answer. R3, we want R3 to base its router ID on a new interface that's not been configured already. Remember, the configs showed all the relevant config. So here's an interface, gig 00. Notice R3 hasn't shown a gig 00 yet, and there's the address you would use on that interface. So base the RID on that interface's new address. And then router R4, base the router ID on the initial config. Basically, predict the router ID that R4 has already chosen and don't configure in any way to influence it. Those are your marching orders for the lab. So go do the lab. Here's the direct link to go to the page. You have to go to that page to download the packet tracer file. Go do it. And then if you like, afterwards, you can check your answer and explanation at the blog post or in the review video that's linked in the description down below. Why are you still here? Go do lab. Seriously though, if you want some other videos, you'll see a few suggested ones pop up here. If you're new to the channel, I always like to emphasize these review videos. So subscribe, you'll hear more about those, as well as the explainer videos that explain the topic. So you'll know more about how to do the review activities. All right, later folks.